Welcome to Mindset Mondays, the weekly bite-sized podcast designed to build a happier, healthier headspace. Think of it as a learning snack for your morning commute to set your week up right. I'm Mark Holloway, and today we're talking about something that I suspect a lot of you already know you need to do, but find genuinely difficult. Boundaries. Not in the abstract theoretical sense, in the practical, everyday sense. The ability to say no to things that drain you without feeling like a bad person, to protect your time and energy without a lengthy justification, to show up fully for the people and things that matter most because you haven't already given everything to the things that matter least. Most people who struggle with boundaries don't struggle because they don't know what a boundary is. They struggle because every time they try to set one, they run headlong into guilt. The feeling that they're being selfish, difficult, cold, or unkind. Today, we're going to dismantle that guilt with research, with honesty, and with some very practical tools. Let me start with the guilt because I think it's worth understanding where it comes from before we try to move past it. For most of us, the discomfort around setting boundaries was baked in early. Whether through family dynamics, cultural messages, or formative experiences, many of us learned, often without anyone explicitly saying it, that our worth was tied to our availability, that being a good person meant saying yes, that putting others first was a virtue, and putting yourself first was something to be ashamed of. These messages are particularly strong for certain groups. Women who are socialized towards caregiving and agreeableness to a degree that men often aren't. People from collectivist cultural backgrounds where the group's needs are explicitly prioritized over the individual's. And people who grew up in environments where saying no had real consequences, emotional withdrawal, conflict, even rejection. The result, therefore, for many people is what psychologists call people-pleasing, a pattern of behavior in which the need to be liked, approved of, or seen as helpful consistently overrides your own needs, preferences, and limits. And here's the thing about people-pleasing that often gets unspoken. It doesn't come from generosity. It comes from fear. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being seen as selfish or difficult. The yes isn't a gift, it's a defense mechanism. Dr. Harriet Lerner, psychologist and author of The Dance of Anger and The Dance of Intimacy, has written extensively on this. She argues that the inability to set limits isn't a character strength, it's a form of emotional avoidance. When we say yes to avoid the discomfort of saying no, we are prioritizing our short-term comfort over our long-term health, our relationships, and our capacity to actually show up for the people we care about. That reframe from setting boundaries is selfish to not setting boundaries is unsustainable is where this conversation should begin. Before we go further, I want to be precise about what we mean, because the word boundary gets used loosely and can mean very different things. A boundary is not a wall. It's not a way of shutting people out, punishing people, or declaring yourself unavailable to the world. A boundary is simply a clear definition of what you will and won't engage with, what you're available for and what you're not, what you need to function well, and what compromises your ability to do so. Dr. Brené Brown, research professor at the University of Houston and one of the most influential voices on vulnerability, shame and human connection, defines a boundary as simply what's okay and what's not okay. That's it. Nothing more complicated or confrontational than that. What Brown's research has also found, and this is one of the most counterintuitive findings in this space, is that the most generous, compassionate and giving people she studied are also consistently the people with the clearest boundaries, not despite their generosity, but because of it. The logic is straightforward once you see it. People who give without limits eventually burn out, build resentment, or start giving from a place of obligation rather than genuine care. People who are clear about their limits can give wholeheartedly within them because they're not running on empty and they're not secretly resentful about what they've given up. Brown puts it simply. The most compassionate people I've ever interviewed over the last 13 years were also the most boundaried. Boundaries don't make you less giving, they make your giving sustainable and real. The cost of chronically poor boundaries is well documented across several areas of research. Burnout. The World Health Organization formally recognized burnout as an occupational phenomenon in 2019, defining it as a resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Research by Christina Maslach at the University of California, Berkeley, who has studied burnout for over 4 decades, identifies 3 core components: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. All 3 are significantly exacerbated by the inability to limit demands on your time and energy. Maslach's work consistently shows that people who cannot protect their own resources, who are always available, always accommodating, always absorbing more, are the most vulnerable to burnout. Resentment. This is one of the more subtler but corrosive consequences of poor boundaries. When you consistently say yes to things you mean no to, resentment accumulates, often toward the people you're saying yes for, even though they may have no idea you felt pressured. Dr. Lerner's research on relational dynamics found that resentment is one of the clearest signals that a limit has been violated, usually by yourself. The anger isn't really about the other person, it's a signal that something important to you has been compromised. Decision fatigue and depleted performance. We covered decision fatigue in episode 24, but it connects directly here. Every time you override your own instinct to say no, you're making a decision under pressure, and every unnecessary commitment you make adds to the cognitive and logistical load of your life. People with poor boundaries don't just feel more tired, they have objectively less capacity for the things that matter most. Relationship quality. Paradoxically, poor boundaries tend to damage the relationship they're designed to protect. When you say yes from obligation rather than genuine willingness, the quality of what you give is different. Flatter, more strained, less present. And when resentment builds, it leaks in tone, in body language, in the quality of attention you bring. The relationships that feel most draining are often the ones in which the lack of honest limit setting has allowed an imbalance to develop that neither person has ever directly addressed. Let me bring in some real voices, because this topic is one where hearing how others have navigated it is particularly useful. Oprah Winfrey. She has spoken candidly and repeatedly about her own long struggle with boundaries, describing herself as a lifelong people pleaser who spent years saying yes to almost everything, driven by a deep need for approval. In an interview she gave about a period of profound burnout in the mid-1990s, she described a turning point in which she realized that her inability to say no wasn't generosity. It was a fear of disappointing people that was slowly destroying her. She began working with a therapist and developed what she calls the practice of pausing before responding, creating a space to ask, does this align with what I actually want and need, before giving an automatic yes. Emma Thompson, the actress and writer, has been publicly vocal for years about the importance of protecting creative and personal energy, describing the entertainment industry as a machine that will consume everything you give it and still come back for more. She has spoken about learning to say no to projects, to appearances, to demands on her time, not from laziness, but from a clear-eyed recognition that her creative work requires reserves that constant availability depletes. Michelle Obama, in her memoir Becoming, and in subsequent interviews, wrote candidly about her marriage, when she felt her own needs and ambitions were consistently being subordinated to Barack's career. The process of reclaiming her own priorities, professionally, personally, as a mother, required what she described as genuinely difficult conversations and a willingness to be clear about what she needed, even in the face of guilt and external expectation. Serena Williams, whom we discussed in our Identity Gap episode in the context of her sense of self as a competitor, has also been outspoken about learning to protect her energy and time boundaries as she navigated fame, motherhood, and a relentlessly demanding professional life. She has spoken about the lesson, learned the hard way, that saying no to certain commitments was not a failure of generosity, but a prerequisite for sustained excellence. What connects all of these examples is honesty. None of them are presenting boundaries as something that came naturally or easily. They're describing a hard-won recognition that the guilt, while real, was not an accurate signal of wrongdoing. It was a conditioned response that needed to be examined and updated. So, how do you actually do this? Because knowing what you should set better limits and being able to do it in the moment are very different things. Principle 1. Recognize guilt as a signal, not a verdict. Guilt, when it arises from a genuine values violation, when you've actually done something that conflicts your own ethics, is useful and worth attending to. But the guilt that arises from simply saying no, from declining a request, from protecting your time, that is not a verdict on your character. It is a conditioned emotional response trained by years of learning that your worth depended on your availability. Noticing the guilt without immediately obeying it is the first and most important step. Principle 2. You don't owe a long explanation. One of the most liberating pieces of advice Dr. Lerner offers is that a limit doesn't require a detailed justification. The longer and more elaborate the explanation, the more it signals that you believe you need to earn the right to say no. A clear, warm, brief response is almost always more honest and more respectful than a lengthy defensive apology. I can't commit to that right now is a complete sentence. That doesn't work for me is a complete sentence. You can be kind without being elaborate. Principle 3. Separate the person from the request. Declining a request is not rejecting a person. This distinction, obvious in theory, is easily lost in the moment, particularly with people we care about or feel responsible for. Practice making the distinction explicit. I care about you and I can't do this particular thing. Both parts are true. One doesn't cancel the other. Principle 4. Start small and build evidence. If you've spent years saying yes to almost everything, trying to overhaul your limits overnight is both unrealistic and unnecessarily disruptive. Start with lower stakes situations, a request you can genuinely decline without major consequence, and notice what actually happens. In most cases, the catastrophe you feared doesn't materialize. The relationship survives. The world doesn't end. Building that evidence base gradually reduces the grip of the fear that has been driving the automatic yes. And principle 5, remember that resentment is a signal. Pay attention to where resentment is already building in your life. Resentment is almost always a flag marking a place where you've been saying yes when you meant no. Rather than managing the resentment, ask what limit setting it might be pointing toward. So, here are your 2 mindset shifts for the coming week. Both deliberately modest in scope because this is an area where sustainable change is built incrementally, not in one dramatic overhaul. Mindset shift 1, the resentment audit. This week, take 10 minutes and ask yourself honestly, where in my life is resentment currently building? It might be at work, a colleague who consistently offloads onto you, a workload that has crept beyond what's reasonable. It might be at home, a dynamic in which your needs are consistently last. It might be socially, commitments you've already agreed to that you're already dreading. Write them down without judgment. Then, for one, ask, what would a clear, fair limit look like here? What would I need to say or stop agreeing to bring this back into balance? You don't have to act on them all immediately. The point this week is simply to identify where the limits are missing, because you can't set a boundary you haven't first recognized as necessary. The resentment is already there. This exercise just makes it visible and useful. Mindset shift 2. Practice one deliberate no this week. Find one situation this week, ideally something relatively low stakes, where your instinct is to say yes out of obligation, guilt or habit, rather than genuine willingness, and say no. It doesn't have to be a dramatic conversation. It can be as simple as declining an optional meeting, pushing back on a last-minute request, or not responding to a message outside your working hours. The point is the practice. You are building the neural and emotional evidence that saying no does not make you a bad person, that the guilt, while uncomfortable, passes, that the relationship, in most cases, remains intact, that you can protect your energy and still be a kind, caring, and generous person. One deliberate no this week. Notice what happens both externally and in how you feel about yourself afterward. So let's bring all this together. Boundaries are not walls. They are not selfishness. They are not a failure of generosity or care. They are the honest definition of what you need to function well, and the research around the experience of some of the most thoughtful and giving people in the world is consistent. The people who give most sustainably are the people who are clearest about their limits. The guilt is real, but it is not accurate. It is a conditioned response, not a reliable moral compass. And like all conditioned responses, it can be examined, challenged, and gradually updated through understanding where it came from and through the slow accumulation of evidence that saying no doesn't end relationships, doesn't make you selfish, and doesn't make you less worthy of love. It just makes you honest, and honest is sustainable in a way that obligation-driven yes never is. So, this week, run the resentment audit, practice one deliberate no. Start Monday strong and let that momentum carry you forward. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mindset Mondays. If it resonated, especially if you know someone who gives and gives and never seems to ask for anything in return, please share it with them. And I look forward to seeing you next Monday.